There's a kind of silence that only exists in the middle of Iowa in November. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that comes after a hard day's work and when you sit on the porch and watch the sun go down over flat land that stretches so far it seems to curve with the earth. This is a different silence. It is the silence of a house where children used to live. It is the silence of rooms that still smell like someone else's breakfast, someone who left 3 weeks ago and has not called since Tuesday. It is the silence of a man sitting at a kitchen table at 4 in the morning, staring at a stack of papers he has read so many times, the creases are starting to split. That was the silence Elliot Greer knew in November of 1983. He was 45 years old. He had been farming since he was 9. He had driven a tractor before he could legally drive a car. He had watched his father, August Greer, work this same land through drought and flood and price collapse and government policy that seemed designed by people who had never once touched actual dirt. And through all of it, August Greer had kept the farm. Not through luck, not through connections, through one rule that he held to like scripture. You do not borrow money against land your grandfather bled for. August said it at the dinner table. He said it at church. He said it to the loan officer at Grundy County Savings and Loan, who called every spring with new programs and favorable rates and the language of opportunity. He said it with the same flat certainty that he said everything, not as a philosophy, as a fact of nature. The way you might say water runs downhill or winter follows fall. August Greer died in 1978 and left Elliot 240 acres of paid-off black Iowa soil, a John Deere that ran, if you knew where to kick it, in that one rule. Elliot kept the rule for 2 years. Then 1980 happened. You have to understand what 1980 felt like from inside it. Not from the outside looking back where everything is obvious and the mistakes seem almost willful. From inside, 1980 felt like the moment the world finally decided to reward people who were willing to be bold. The agricultural magazines were full of articles about expansion. The extension office held meetings where men in suits stood at projectors and showed graphs going up and to the right. Land values had been climbing for a decade. Export markets were open. The Soviet grain deals were moving billions of bushels. Corn prices were strong. The story everyone kept telling each other was simple. If you are not growing, you are dying. Elliot Greer was not a foolish man. He was not impulsive. He sat with the numbers for 6 months before he made his decision. He drove out to look at the acreage his neighbor Delwyn Stacks was selling. He drove out 3 times. He walked the fields in August when the corn was tall and the soil was dark and rich and everything about it looked like money. He talked to other farmers. He talked to the county agent. He talked to 2 different bankers. They all said the same thing. This is the moment. Do not miss it. In March of 1980, Elliot Greer walked into Grundy County Savings and Loan and signed his name on a mortgage note for $180,000. He used the money to buy an additional 160 acres from Delwyn Stacks and a new piece of equipment that his father would have called an extravagance and Elliot called an investment. He drove home that day feeling something he had not felt in a long time. He felt like a man moving forward. What happened next did not happen all at once. That is the thing about financial disaster that nobody warns you about. It does not arrive like a storm you can see on the horizon and prepare for. It arrives the way a slow leak drains a tank. So gradually that each individual day seems almost normal. It is only when you step back and look at where you were 3 years ago that the distance becomes terrifying. In 1980, prime farmland in Grundy County was selling for around $2,800 an acre. By 1982, it had dropped to $2,100. By the fall of 1983, it was barely touching $1,400 and still falling. The land Elliot had bought for leverage was now worth significantly less than what he owed on it. Interest rates on farm loans had climbed past 18%. Some farmers in the county were paying $20 on operating loans. Corn prices that had averaged $3.11 a bushel in 1980 were now hovering around $2.50. And that was if you could find a buyer who was not also drowning. In real terms, what this meant was that Elliot Greer's loan payments stayed exactly the same while his income dropped by nearly a third. The equity cushion he had counted on evaporated. Not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic moment, but steadily the way hope leaves a man who has been waiting too long for something that is not coming. By the fall of 1983, Elliot was $43,000 behind on his loan payments. Burton Crew, the manager at Grundy County Savings and Loan, had sent 3 letters. Each one was more formal than the last. The final notice arrived in October. It gave Elliot until December 1st. Pay what is owed or face foreclosure proceedings. His wife, Margaret, had taken their 2 sons to her mother's house in Ames in late September. They had not fought about it. That was almost worse. She had simply looked at him one morning across the breakfast table and said she needed to take the boys somewhere. The phone was not ringing with collectors. He had nodded. She had packed. The house had gone quiet in a way that seemed permanent, even when it was not. His brother Douglas had come by twice, and both times suggested that Elliot contact a company out of Des Moines that was consolidating farmland on behalf of corporate interests. They were paying not good prices, but cash in hand when you are 3 weeks from foreclosure is not nothing. Douglas meant well. Douglas always meant well. But Elliot had looked at him both times and thought about his father and said no both times without being able to fully explain why. $400. That is what was left in Elliot Greer's checking account on the morning of November 12, 1983. $400 and 21 days. He decided to go to the auction, not because he expected to buy anything. He was not there to spend money he did not have on equipment he could not use. He went because staying in that silent house was becoming something he could not afford in a different way. He went because a farm auction in Iowa in November is still a gathering of people, and people who are struggling find a specific and unspoken comfort in being around other people who are also struggling, even if nobody says it out loud. The auction was for the estate of Cormac Aldridge. Cormac had died in August at the age of 92. He had farmed 320 acres north of Grundy Center for almost 70 years. He had never married. He had no children. His closest living relatives were 2 second cousins in Nebraska who had never visited and had not known Cormac was ill until they received a letter from a county administrator. When Cormac died, the county appointed an estate manager to liquidate everything: land, equipment, tools, household goods, and everything in the barn, in the cellar, in the machine shed. All of it had to go. Elliot had known Cormac the way you know people in a small county, not as a friend, more as a presence. A man who had always been there, quiet and separate, working his fields with a consistency that other farmers noticed even if they did not remark on it. Cormac Aldridge was not a man who invited conversation, but he was a man who earned respect without asking for it. Elliot's father, August, had mentioned Cormac occasionally over the years, always with that particular tone he reserved for people he considered serious. What August said about Cormac was this: that man walked through the Depression without losing a single acre, watched half the county go under, and came out the other side the same as he went in. You want to know the secret to that? The most valuable things in this world are the ones nobody is looking at. Elliot had heard that phrase many times growing up. He had filed it away with the other things his father said that sounded like wisdom, but did not seem to apply to the present moment. He remembered it when he saw the crate. The auction yard was mud and diesel smoke, and the low murmur of men who did not have much to say to each other. The equipment had already moved. A combine, a couple of tractors, some implements, all sold to buyers who knew what they were looking at. The smaller items were going fast: household furniture, hand tools, the kind of accumulated life debris that an old man alone on a farm collects over 70 years. People move through it efficiently and without sentiment because sentiment at an auction is expensive. Lot 247 had been sitting at the edge of the yard all morning. It was a wooden crate roughly 3 feet tall and 2 feet wide, made of dark oak that had turned almost black with age. Metal bands wrapped around it rusted the color of old blood. On the front, a padlock so corroded that 3 different men had tried to cut it off before the auction and failed. The chalk marking on the side was barely readable. C.A. 1933. Keep. That was all. No inventory description. No contents listed. Sold as is. The auctioneer had announced it as Lot 247. Wooden storage crate, contents unknown, sold as is. He had asked for $50 to start. Nobody raised a hand. He dropped to $25. Still nothing. Then 10. The crowd looked at that crate the way people look at something they have already decided is worthless. Not with curiosity, with the mild contempt of men who are practical and do not have time for mysteries. The auctioneer skipped it, moved on. came back to it twice more, and got the same silence both times. Elliot stood at the back of the crowd with his hands in his coat pockets and $400 in cash folded in his front shirt pocket, and he could not look away from that crate. He thought about what his father had said about Cormac Aldridge. He thought about the chalk marking, C.A. Cormac Aldridge, 1933, the worst year of the Depression. The year banks were failing across Iowa, and farms were going to auction, and families were packing whatever fit in a truck and driving away from land that had been in their families for generations. 1933 was the year a man either lost everything or decided what he was going to protect. And Cormac had written one word: keep. Elliot did not know what was in the crate. He had no reason to believe it was anything other than old tools or spare parts, or the kind of obsolete equipment that accumulates in a barn over 50 years. He could not have explained to anyone, including himself, what made him watch that crate instead of walking back to his truck and driving home to his silent house. But he watched it, and something in the watching felt like recognition. The auctioneer came back to lot 247 for the fourth time. He had the bored efficiency of a man who has been on his feet since 7 in the morning and would like to close the books on this particular item. Last call on lot 247. $10. Anyone? The silence was complete. The auctioneer began to move on. Elliot Greer raised his hand. Then he heard his own voice say the number before he had consciously decided to say it. $400. Cash. The yard went quiet in a different way. The murmur stopped. Heads turned. Someone near the front made a sound that was almost a laugh, the kind of involuntary noise a person makes when they witness something they cannot immediately process. The auctioneer looked at Elliot with an expression that mixed surprise with professional concern. He said what the situation required him to say. "Sir, you understand the contents are completely unknown. We cannot make any representation about what is inside or whether it has any value at all." Elliot heard himself say, "I understand. $400. The auctioneer looked at the crate. He looked at the crowd. He looked back at Elliot with the expression of a man who has seen a great many things at auctions and has long since stopped trying to explain human behavior. The gavel came down. Sold. Elliot stood there for a moment after the sound. The crowd was already moving on to the next lot. A few men glanced back at him with expressions ranging from puzzlement to something that looked almost like pity. One man shook his head slowly, not meanly, just the way you shake your head when you see something that confirms a belief you already held about the world. Elliot paid the cashier. He waited while 2 of the auction workers carried the crate to his truck. He noticed when they lifted it that it was heavy, perhaps 100 pounds, and that when they tilted it slightly to get it over the tailgate, something inside shifted. Metal on metal, a sound that suggested weight and solidity, not something light, not empty space. He drove home slowly on roads that were freezing in the late afternoon, the crate sitting in the bed of the truck behind him. He had $400. Now he had $0. 21 days until December 1st. He pulled into his driveway and sat in the truck for a while without getting out. The farm around him was in the particular condition of a place that is still functional, but beginning to show the signs of a man who has been managing alone. Not ruined, not abandoned, but carrying the slightly worn look of a property where one person is doing the work of 2 and spending more time with paperwork than with maintenance. He went inside and called Margaret in Ames. He told her what he had done. There was a long silence on the other end of the line that was worse than anger would have been. Then she said in a voice that was very controlled and very tired that she did not know what he expected to find in a box that nobody else at an entire auction had wanted to buy. He did not have an answer for that. He told her he would call her when he knew more. She said okay. She said to eat something. He said he would. He did not eat anything. He sat in the kitchen for a while and then he went out to the barn and stood next to the crate in the cold and the dark and looked at it. He tried the padlock. It did not move. Whatever corrosion had seized it over 50 years had turned the mechanism into something closer to solid metal than a functional lock. He could cut it. He had a hacksaw in the tool chest. But he looked at the chalk letters in the glow of the single bare bulb and something stopped him. Keep. It was a strange thing to feel standing in a freezing barn with nothing in his account and 21 days on the clock. But the word felt like it meant something beyond its literal function. Like it was not just an instruction about the crate, Like Cormac Aldrich had written it, knowing someone would eventually read it under circumstances that required more than a casual decision about whether to proceed. Elliot went back inside. He set his alarm for 5:30. He did not sleep much. The crate sat in the barn. The next morning, he drove through the gray November light into Grundy Center and stood in front of the county clerk's office when it opened. He wanted to know whatever the public record contained about Cormac Aldrich. What he found was sparse. Cormac had paid his property taxes every year, without exception, going back to 1931. He had filed no liens, held no mortgages, made no recorded legal claims against anyone. He appeared in the record exactly as he had appeared in life, as a man who was present, consistent, and entirely without drama. The clerk, a woman named Sylvia, who had worked in that office for 20 years, mentioned that the estate administrator had been surprised when they inventoried the house. For a man who had farmed over 300 acres for 7 decades, Cormac had almost nothing in the way of savings accounts or investments that they could find. A small checking account with a few $100s. No safe deposit box at any local bank. No stocks or bonds registered in his name through any local institution. Elliot thanked her and drove home. He sat with that piece of information for the rest of the day. No financial instruments registered locally. No visible wealth for a man who had farmed productive Iowa land for 7 decades and apparently never borrowed against it. Either Cormac Aldrich had lived his entire life on the minimal margins of a small-scale farming operation, which was possible but seemed inconsistent with never losing ground during decades of agricultural volatility, or whatever Cormac had accumulated over a lifetime, was somewhere that the county administrators had not looked. On the third morning after the auction, Elliot was sitting on an overturned bucket in the barn, drinking cold coffee from a thermos, staring at the crate when he noticed something he had not seen before. On the bottom edge of the front panel, partially hidden under decades of grime and a strip of cracked rubber weather seal, there was a small metal plate. He had to get down on one knee and wipe it with his sleeve to read it clearly. What it said stopped him cold. Property of First National Bank Waterloo, Safety Deposit Transfer Container. Unit 17. He sat back on his heels and looked at the plate for a long time. A safety deposit transfer container. He had heard of them but never seen one. Before armored car services became standard, banks used to transport high-value items between branches in these specialized containers. Heavy construction, serious locks designed to be both durable and tamper-evident. They were not common even in their day. And they were not used for ordinary items. You did not put grain records or spare tractor parts in a bank transfer container. Elliot went to his father's old toolbox and found the set of lockpicks that August had bought at an auction sometime in the early 1950s, wrapped in an oilcloth pouch that had preserved them almost perfectly. August had never been a suspicious man. He simply believed that a person who could not open a thing they owned was at the mercy of whoever could. Elliot had watched his father use the picks twice in 40 years. He had never used them himself. He worked for nearly 2 hours. The corrosion in the lock mechanism had not frozen it completely. It had simply made every tumbler require more pressure and more patience than a normal lock. He broke one pick early and had to stop and think about his approach. His hands were not steady. They were not steady because his entire life was sitting on the other side of a decision he had made in 30 seconds in a muddy auction yard, and the rational part of his mind had been running a quiet background argument about the probability of disaster since the moment the gavel came down. He kept working, and then with a sound like something fundamental giving way, the lock opened. The smell came first. Old paper and dried oil, and something metallic underneath, both the particular scent of sealed air that has not moved in a very long time. The inside of the crate was lined with oilcloth, yellowed and brittle, but still intact. The seal had worked. Whatever was inside had been protected from moisture and temperature fluctuation with a degree of care that spoke to serious intention. Lying on top, covering whatever was beneath, was a piece of burlap. Pinned to the burlap was a note written in the careful handwriting of a man who did not write quickly, who formed each letter with the deliberate attention of someone who learned penmanship before the war and never lost the habit. For whoever finds this, I put these things away in the bad times. Figured I might need them someday. Turns out I never did. Maybe you will. C.M., November 1933. Elliot read the note twice, then he set it carefully on the workbench and lifted the burlap. Beneath it was a layer of hand tools, Wrenches, pliers, a hand drill, a set of chisels. Good quality for their era, the kind of tools a careful man bought once and maintained well. Elliot lifted them out one by one and set them on the barn floor. They were not what he was looking for. He knew that even as he removed them with the same care he would have given to something fragile, beneath the tools was a layer of newspapers from 1933, folded and stacked with precision. The headlines were a catalog of collapse, bank closures in 7 states, farm foreclosures across the Midwest, Roosevelt's emergency banking legislation, grain prices at historic lows, families leaving, land sitting idle. Elliot set the newspapers aside, and beneath the newspapers, wrapped in a second piece of oilcloth that had preserved it as well as the first, was a metal box. Steel approximately the size of a large dictionary with a simple hinge latch. No lock on this one, just the latch and whatever was inside. Elliot lifted it out and set it on the workbench. His hands were not steady. He was aware of his own breathing in the cold air of the barn. He opened the latch. Inside was a stack of documents, some in folders, some loose, all of them old, all of them handled with care at some point and then preserved with the same intentionality as everything else in this crate. Elliot picked up the top document. It was a certificate, heavy paper, the kind that had texture and weight in your hands. Ornate border printing, official government seals, careful typography. At the top, in bold letters that had faded from black to dark brown over 50 years, United States Treasury Bond, Series E War Savings Bond. Elliot had seen savings bonds before. His father had purchased several during the Second World War and cashed them in the early 1960s. They were common instruments, denominations of $25, $50, $100. He looked at the face value printed on the certificate in his hand. $5,000. He set it down and picked up the next one. $5,000. The one after that. $5,000. He went through them one by one, setting each on the workbench in a row. 10 certificates, 10 bonds, each one for $5,000. Dated 1933. Series E. $50,000 in bonds from 1933. He stood there in the coal barn and looked at the row of certificates and did the rough calculation that anyone would do in that moment. $50,000 held for 50 years at any reasonable compound interest rate was not $50,000 anymore. He kept going through the box. Stock certificates for companies he did not recognize. Some of the names were unfamiliar in ways that suggested they no longer existed under those names, absorbed or dissolved or renamed over the decades. A document that appeared to be a deed to mineral rights on a property in West Texas, the kind of instrument that could mean anything from nothing to a great deal depending on what was under that land. A bank passbook from a Chicago institution showing a balance of $12,000 dated 1933, and at the very bottom of the box, a letter. The envelope bore the return address of a law firm in Des Moines. The date was September 1933. The letter was addressed to Cormac Aldridge, care of his farm address outside Grundy Center. Elliot read it standing at the workbench in his coal barn on a November morning, with 21 days until he lost everything his father had built. The letter was from a partner at the law firm, informing Cormac that the transfer of assets from his late uncle's estate had been completed. The total value of those assets at current market prices was approximately $147,000. Given the current instability of the banking system, the letter recommended that Cormac consider keeping the securities in a secure private location rather than depositing them with any financial institution. The letter noted that Cormac's uncle had been a careful man who had avoided the speculative excesses of the previous decade, and that his caution had now become Cormac's inheritance. Elliot set the letter down. He sat on the overturned bucket again. He looked at the row of bond certificates on the workbench. He looked at the stock documents and the Texas deed in the Chicago passbook. He looked at Cormac's note still sitting where he had placed it. $50,000 in 1933 bonds. 50 years of compound interest. Stock certificates that might be worthless or might represent shares in companies that had grown substantially over half a century. Mineral rights in Texas that were either sitting over nothing or over something significant. A bank account in Chicago that might or might not still exist in any functional form. Cormac Aldridge had inherited a fortune in 1933 at the worst possible moment, during the deepest trough of the Depression. When banks were failing and farms were being auctioned for pennies and the entire agricultural economy of the Midwest was in freefall. And he had put it in a box. He had written one word on the outside, and he had buried it under 50 years of accumulated life. Elliot Greer sat in his coal barn on the morning of November 15th, 1983, with $400 in his bank account and 21 days until foreclosure, and looked at what might be a fortune or might be a pile of old paper. He did not know yet which one it was, but for the first time in months, he was not thinking about December 1st. He was thinking about what kind of man puts something in a box and writes keep and then never opens it again. He was thinking about what Cormac Aldridge had been waiting for, and he was thinking in a way he could not yet fully articulate that perhaps the most important question was not what was in the box. Perhaps the most important question was why it had been left for him to find. Elliot did not sleep that night either. He sat at the kitchen table with the metal box open in front of him and a legal pad beside it where he had been writing numbers. Not precise numbers. He did not have the tools for precision yet, but rough numbers, the kind a farmer does in his head when he is trying to understand the scale of something before he commits to believing it is real. $50,000 in Series E bonds from 1933. He knew enough about compound interest to know that 50 years at even a modest rate turned 50,000 into something dramatically larger. He did not know the exact rate the Treasury had paid on those instruments. He did not know if all 10 certificates were fully valid or if some had conditions attached that would reduce their value. But the range his rough arithmetic kept producing was somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000. That number sat in the middle of the kitchen table like something with physical weight. He looked at the stock certificates again. 8 of them for companies whose names he did not recognize. Some of those names had the quality of things that had simply ceased to exist. Others felt like they might have been absorbed into something larger, the way small rivers disappear into bigger ones without vanishing entirely. He could not assess them without research. That much was clear. The Texas deed was a single page dense with legal language about mineral rights to a parcel of land in Reeves County. Elliot had no immediate way to know what was under that land or whether anyone had ever attempted to extract anything from it. Mineral rights could be worth enormous amounts, or they could be worth the paper they were printed on, depending entirely on geology and circumstance. The Chicago passbook showed $12,000 in a savings account at an institution called Midwest Fidelity Trust. Whether that institution still existed, whether the account had been maintained, whether the money was still there in any form, he could not know from a barn in Iowa at 2 in the morning. What he could know sitting there with the lamplight yellow on the old documents was that Cormac Aldridge had carefully and deliberately preserved all of this for 50 years without touching any of it. The oilcloth wrapping, the bank transfer container, the padlock. These were not the actions of a man who forgot he had something. These were the actions of a man who made a decision and held to it with the same quiet consistency he had apparently applied to everything else in his life. Elliot thought about that for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Harlan Dow. Harlan Dow had been practicing law in Waterloo for 35 years. He was 63 years old, wore wire-rimmed glasses that he had a habit of removing and cleaning when he was processing something complicated, and had a reputation in Grundy County for being the kind of lawyer who told you exactly what he thought, even when what he thought was not what you wanted to hear. Elliot's father had used him twice for land matters. Elliot had met him at August's funeral and twice since then at the grain elevator. Harlan answered on the 4th ring with the voice of a man who had not been asleep. Elliot told him what he had found. He described the crate, the bank transfer container marking the bond certificates, the stock documents, the Texas deed, the Chicago passbook, the letter from 1933. He read Harlan the lawyer's letter from the Des Moines firm word for word. There was a long silence on the other end. Then Harlan said he would drive out the next afternoon. He arrived at 2 o'clock in a brown sedan that had seen better decades, carrying a leather briefcase and the expression of a man who had prepared himself to be either very interested or very disappointed and was not yet sure which. Elliot led him to the kitchen where the metal box and all its contents were laid out on the table in the order they had been found. Harlan spent 2 hours going through everything. He read the bond certificates carefully, holding each one up to the kitchen light to examine the seals. He looked at the stock documents and made notes on a yellow pad. He read the Texas deed twice and then a third time. He set the Chicago passbook aside with a slight tightening around his eyes that Elliot could not fully interpret. He read the Des Moines letter and cleaned his glasses. When he was finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs. Elliot asked him what he thought. Harlan put his glasses back on and said this: "The Treasury bonds are real. Series E bonds issued in 1933 are well-documented instruments. The Bureau of Public Debt in Washington maintains records going back to the Depression era and can verify these certificates against their records. If they check out, and nothing I am seeing here suggests they would not, then the question is only what $50,000 in bonds from 1933 has grown to over 50 years of compound interest." Harlan paused. His estimate was somewhere between $200,000 and $250,000, possibly more depending on the specific rate schedules that applied to Depression-era Series E instruments. Elliot held that number steady in his mind and did not react to it visibly. Harlan moved on. The stock certificates, he said, were more complicated. Some of these company names were familiar to him as entities that had existed in the late 20s and early 30s and were known to have dissolved or restructured during the Depression or the war years. Those certificates were likely worthless, but not necessarily all of them. Corporate genealogies in American business were complex and sometimes surprising. A company that appeared to have vanished could have been absorbed into something that grew substantially over the following decades. This would require research through SEC records and corporate filings. It could not be assessed tonight. The Texas mineral rights deed was a legitimate instrument. Whether the rights had value was entirely a function of what was under the land and whether anyone had ever attempted to develop it. Harlan did not know. He said the deed would need to be verified with the Texas General Land Office and that the process would take time. The Chicago passbook, Harlan said, with the particular tone of a man delivering a provisional verdict, was the most uncertain element. Midwest Fidelity Trust had not survived into the current era. Whether the account or its contents had been transferred to another institution, absorbed into the FDIC resolution process when the bank closed or simply ceased to exist, was something he could not determine without contacting the Illinois Banking Commission. Then Harlan said the thing Elliot had been waiting for him to say. There is also a legal question about ownership. You purchased the crate at a legitimate public auction conducted by an authorized estate administrator. The contents were sold as is, meaning the buyer accepts whatever is inside with no representation from the seller. Under Iowa law, your claim to the contents of that crate is strong. But the estate administrator did not know the value of what was inside. If the estate had known there were securities worth potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in that crate, they would not have sold it as lot 247 for $400. There may be a challenge. Elliot asked him how serious a challenge. Harlan cleaned his glasses. He said in his opinion, not a winning one. The auction was properly conducted. The sale was final. The as-is designation protects the buyer from claims of misrepresentation. And Cormac Aldridge, as the original owner, had 50 years to disclose these assets to anyone including family members or legal representatives and had apparently chosen not to. But Harlan wanted Elliot to know the risk existed, so he was not surprised if it materialized. Elliot nodded. Then he said what Harlan had not expected him to say. He said he wasn't going to wait for Harlan to make the first call to Washington. He was going to call the Bureau of Public Debt himself that morning. Harlan looked at him over the wire-rimmed glasses. He said that was not how this was typically done, that there were procedural reasons why a lawyer usually made initial contact in behalf of a client, that it was generally advisable to let legal counsel. Elliot said he understood all of that. He said he had 21 days and he needed to know if these bonds were real before he spent any more time on the rest of it. He was not going to wait. Harlan looked at him for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and said he understood and that he would prepare a letter of verification to accompany any documentation Elliot submitted. The next morning at 8 o'clock, Elliot called the Bureau of Public Debt's regional office in Chicago. He was transferred twice before reaching a woman in the verification department named Mrs. Alderton, who had the voice of someone who had spent 30 years answering questions about old financial instruments and was not easily surprised. Elliot explained what he had. Series E savings bonds, 10 certificates, $5,000, face value each, issued 1933, currently in the possession of the purchaser of an Iowa estate auction. There was a pause. Mrs. Alderton said carefully that Series E bonds from 1933 were among the earliest Depression-era instruments issued under the Roosevelt administration's Emergency Financial Stabilization Program. They were legitimate Treasury obligations. She said she had not received an inquiry about a Depression-era Series E bond in quite some time. Elliot said he understood. He asked her what the redemption process involved and what the current value of these instruments would be after 50 years of interest accumulation. She walked him through the verification process. He would need to submit the physical certificates along with documentation of legal ownership, which in his case meant a copy of the auction records and the estate sale documentation. The Bureau would verify the certificates against their records. The process typically took 6 to 8 weeks. Elliot asked about the value. Mrs. Alderton was quiet for a moment, and he could hear the soft sound of someone working through a calculation. Then she said that Series E bonds issued in 1933 had carried an interest rate structure that had been adjusted multiple times over the decades as Treasury policy changed. Without examining the specific certificates, she could not give him a precise number. But as a general estimate, $50,000 in face value bonds from that era, held continuously for 50 years, would have accumulated to somewhere in the range of $250,000 to potentially over $300,000, depending on the specific series designations and interest adjustment history. Elliot was standing at the kitchen counter with a pen in his hand, and he stopped writing. He thanked her. He wrote down the address for submissions. He hung up the phone and stood at the counter for a while without moving. He called Harlan and gave him the information. Harlan said he would prepare the submission documents. Then Elliot put on his coat and drove to Grundy County Savings and Loan. He had not called ahead. He had not made an appointment. He simply drove to the bank and asked the receptionist if Burton Crew was available, and when she came back and said Mr. Crew was in a meeting, Elliot said he would wait. He waited 40 minutes in a chair near the front window, watching the parking lot and the gray November sky. He did not fidget. He sat the way a man sits when he has decided something and is simply waiting for the machinery of the world to catch up with his decision. Burton Crew came out of his office at 20 past 11. He was a tall man with a permanent expression of mild displeasure, the kind of face that had probably looked slightly disappointed since early middle age. He had signed Elliot's foreclosure notice personally. They had known each other peripherally for 20 years, the way men in small counties know each other by name and reputation, and shared community events without any particular warmth. Crew looked at Elliot in the waiting area, and his expression did not change. He said Elliot could come back. In the office, Elliot set the cardboard box he had carried in from the truck on the edge of Crew's desk. He explained in plain language and without embellishment what he had found in the crate at the Aldridge estate auction. He showed Crew the bond certificates, the letter from the Des Moines law firm, and the written summary Harlan Dow had prepared. He told Crew what Mrs. Alderton at the Bureau of Public Debt had told him about estimated values. He mentioned the stock certificates in the Texas deed and what Harlan believed they might represent. Then he said what he had come to say. He needed 90 days. At the end of 90 days, he would pay the full amount owed. Principal, interest, and all penalties. In cash. Crew looked at the documents without touching them for a long moment. Then he picked up the bond certificate on top of the stack and held it up to the light the same way Harlan had done. He set it down. He looked at Elliot. He said he had sat across this desk from a great many farmers in the past 3 years who had come in with plans and projections and reasons why they needed more time. He said this was the first time anyone had brought a box of Depression-era Treasury bonds as collateral. Elliot said nothing. He let the silence work. Crew looked at the documents again. He said 90 days was unusual. He said the board would need to be informed. He said if any of these documents turned out to be fraudulent or legally compromised, the bank would proceed immediately and without further accommodation. Elliot said he understood every one of those conditions. Crew was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then he said 90 days. He said he wanted weekly written updates from Harlan Dow on the verification progress. He said the first missed update would be treated as a default. They did not shake hands warmly, but they shook hands, and that was enough. The next 6 weeks were the most concentrated work Elliot Greer had done in his life, and none of it involved a tractor or a field. The bond certificates were submitted to the Bureau of Public Debt through Harlan's office 2 days after the meeting with Crew. The verification process began. Meanwhile, Elliott turned his attention to the stock certificates. He drove to the county library in Grundy Center and spent 3 days going through business directories and corporate filings from the 1930s through the 1960s that the library had on microfilm. He was looking for the names on the certificates. He found two of them quickly, and the news was not good. Two of the companies, a manufacturing concern and a regional railroad holding entity, had declared bankruptcy in 1944 and been liquidated entirely. There were no successor companies, no absorbed entities, no residual value. Those two certificates were worthless. Paper and nothing else. He did not let himself sit with that disappointment for long. He moved on. The remaining stock certificates were harder to trace. Three of the company names did not appear in the standard business directories he had access to. He called Harlan, who contacted an attorney in Des Moines, who specialized in corporate history research and SEC filings. The Des Moines attorney took the information and said he would need 2 weeks. While he waited, Elliott wrote to the Texas General Land Office about the mineral rights deed. The response came back in 10 days. It was not what he expected. The Reeves County mineral rights referenced in the deed had been leased to a drilling company in 1957. The lease had been executed through the Aldridge estate administrator at that time, who had apparently been unaware that the mineral rights were held in a separate instrument that had never been registered with the county. The drilling company had been operating under the assumption that the rights were uncontested. Royalty payments from oil extraction on that parcel had been accumulating in a statutory escrow account since 1959, per Texas law governing disputed or uncontacted mineral rights holders. Cormac Aldridge had never been contacted. His address had been listed in the original lease filing, but subsequent correspondence had been sent to an intermediary address that no longer existed. The royalty payments had continued to accumulate for 24 years. Elliott read that letter standing at the kitchen counter and had to set it down and walk to the window and look out at the frozen fields for a while before he could continue reading. After applicable state taxes and the legal fees required to establish Elliott's claim through the auction purchase, the Texas escrow account held a net amount of $112,000. Cormac had land in Texas producing oil for 24 years and had apparently never known about it, or had known and had made the same choice he made about everything else. The Chicago bank account was the next question. Elliott had been putting it off because the answer felt uncertain in a way that made him want to defer it. He finally called the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation and explained the situation. The representative he reached was helpful, but delivered the information without softening it. Midwest Fidelity Trust had closed in 1961 following a period of insolvency. Its accounts had been transferred to FDYC receivership. Individual accounts below a certain threshold had been closed with small administrative disbursements. The account referenced in Elliott's passbook had been closed in the FDYC process. Elliott asked if there was any residual claim possible. The representative said no. The account was closed. The funds had been distributed through the receivership process in 1962. There was nothing remaining. He thanked her and hung up. He sat at the kitchen table and wrote the number 0 on his legal pad next to the word Chicago. Then he sat with the loss of $12,000, which was money he had never had, and had been holding loosely in the accounting of his hopes, and he let himself feel the weight of that particular door closing. It was real. It was disappointing. And then he set the pad aside and moved on the way a farmer moves on from a field that did not produce because the other fields are still there and the season does not pause. 2 days later, the Des Moines attorney called Harlan with the results of the corporate research. The news on the remaining stock certificates was the kind of thing that required Elliott to sit down and look at the ceiling for a moment when Harlan relayed it to him over the phone. 3 of the certificates were for shares in a small petroleum exploration company incorporated in Oklahoma in 1927. That company had been acquired in 1938 by a regional energy conglomerate, which had itself merged in 1951 with a larger entity, which had been absorbed in 1968 into one of the significant American petroleum corporations that still operated actively today. Through each acquisition and merger, shares had been converted at established ratios. The 3 certificates Cormac Aldridge had held represented, after 50 years of splits and conversions and appreciation in the underlying stock, a position in a major petroleum company worth approximately $84,000 at current market prices. Harlan read Elliot the number twice to make sure he had it right. The process of converting those certificates to actual proceeds required filing with the company's transfer agent, establishing the chain of ownership through the corporate genealogy, and executing a formal transfer. It would take time, but it was real. The verification response from the Bureau of Public Debt came back in the 41st day after submission. Elliot was at the kitchen table when the mail arrived. He recognized the government envelope. He set down his coffee and opened it slowly. The Bureau had verified all 10 bond certificates as genuine instruments issued under the Series E Savings Bond Program in November 1933. The certificates had been registered to an Edmund G. Aldridge of Sioux City, Iowa, and had been transferred to Cormac Aldridge through the estate process documented in the Des Moines law firm letter. The transfer of registration to Elliot Greer as the current legal holder contingent on the submission of the auction documentation already on file was approved. The current redemption value of the 10 certificates, including all accumulated interest through the date of the letter, was $267,412. Elliot read that number, then he read it again. He sat at the kitchen table with that letter in his hands for a long time. The morning light was coming through the kitchen window at a low angle the way it comes in winter, and it caught the edge of the metal box still sitting at the end of the table and made it look for a moment like something lit from inside. He thought about Cormac Aldridge. He thought about a 22-year-old man in 1933 receiving a letter from a Des Moines law firm telling him that his uncle had left him $147,000 in the middle of the worst economic collapse the country had seen in its history, when half the county was losing its land, when banks were failing every week, when neighbors were leaving farms their families had held for 3 generations. What would a man do with that? What would most men do? Elliot thought he knew what most men would do. They would deposit the money. They would buy land cheaply from desperate neighbors. They would abandon, modernize, and use the advantage they had been given to build something large. They would do exactly what the economic logic of the moment made possible. Cormac Aldridge had put it in a box. He had written one word on the outside, and he had gone back to farming his 320 acres like a man with no particular advantages and no hidden fortune, living within the margins of what the land produced year after year, decade after decade, until he died at 92, with nothing in his checking account and everything in a crate under 50 years of accumulated barn junk. Why Elliot did not have the answer yet, but he was starting to feel the shape of it. He called Harlan and told him about the Bureau's verification letter. Harlan's response was characteristically measured. He said this was very good news and that they should move immediately to initiate the formal redemption process. He said he would contact the transfer agent for the petroleum company about the stock conversion. He said the Texas escrow claim was already in process, and he expected those funds to be released within 30 days. Elliot said he understood. He thanked Harlan. He told him to proceed. Then he hung up the phone and called Burton Crew at the bank. He did not call with emotion. He did not call with satisfaction or vindication or any of the things a man might feel in that moment. He called the way he had come to do most things in the past 6 weeks, with the plain efficiency of someone who has a job to do and is doing it. He told Crew that the Treasury bonds had been verified. He gave him the redemption value. He said the stock and mineral rights proceeds were in process and would be complete within 30 days. He said he would be in with Harlan Dow within 45 days to discuss full repayment. Crew was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would make a note in the file. It was not an apology, it was not warmth, but it was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement from Burton Crew was its own kind of currency. What came next in those remaining weeks was not dramatic. It was paperwork and the phone calls and the slow institutional grind of turning old documents into current money. It was letters from transfer agents and certified mail to escrow administrators and calls to Harlan about timelines and fees and tax implications. It was the unglamorous work of a man who has found something valuable and must now prove to every relevant institution that it is his. But in the evenings when the phone was quiet and the legal pads were full of numbers that were starting to resolve into something coherent, Elliot found himself thinking not about the money, but about the man who had kept it. He had started going to the Grundy County Historical Society on Saturday mornings. The woman who ran the research room was named Audrey, and she had the particular patience of someone who understood that people came to her with questions that took time to answer properly. Elliot told her he was trying to learn what he could about Cormac Aldridge. She helped him pull what records they had. There was not much. Cormac had not been a man who left a wide documentary footprint. But there were things. Local newspaper mentions from the 30s and 40s. A photograph from a 1937 county fair where Cormac appeared at the edge of a group of farmers standing slightly apart the way he apparently always had. Land records confirming he had never bought or sold a single acre beyond the original property. Tax records showing consistent and prompt payment without exception. And one more thing. Audrey found a copy of a letter Cormac had written to the Des Moines law firm in early 1934, roughly 4 months after he had received the inheritance, and presumably not long after he had put it in the box. The law firm had kept it in their files, and a copy had eventually made its way into the County Historical Archive as part of a donated collection of Depression-era business correspondence. The letter was brief. It was written in the same careful handwriting as the note Elliot had found pinned to the burlap inside the crate. Cormac had informed the law firm that he had decided not to access his uncle's estate at that time. He said that it felt wrong to him to prosper from an inheritance during a period when his neighbors were losing everything they had built. He said he intended to keep the documents in a secure location until circumstances improved sufficiently that he felt he could make use of them with a clear conscience. He closed by saying that if he died before that time came, the matter of what to do with the assets would be left to whoever found them, as he trusted that the right person would find them at the right moment. Elliot sat with that letter for a long time in the quiet of the Historical Society. Cormac Aldridge had not been waiting for circumstances to improve. He had been waiting for something he could not name and could not predict and could not control. He had been waiting with the patience of a man who understands that some things are not his to decide. And in the meantime, he had simply gone on farming, gone on living, gone on being the man his neighbors knew him as, with nothing in his manner or his choices to suggest he was carrying a fortune under the floorboards of his life. Elliot drove home in the early December dark and sat in his truck in the driveway for a while before going inside. The farm was around him in the quiet of an Iowa winter. The fields were bare and frozen and would stay that way until spring. The barn where the crate had sat for the first 3 days was lit by a single bulb visible through the window. He thought about August Greer, his father, who had survived the Depression by never borrowing money and had drilled that principle into his son like a structural beam. He thought about what August would have made of all this. He thought the old man would have been unsurprised in some fundamental way, not by the details, but by the basic proposition that the right thing held carefully and long enough eventually reaches the person it was meant for. Elliot went inside. He made coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with his legal pad. The numbers were almost resolved, and the question of what he was going to do next was becoming clearer by the day. The money came in 3 separate arrivals, the way significant things often do not all at once in a single dramatic moment, but in stages that each required their own adjustment. The Treasury bond redemption cleared first. $267,412 transferred to a temporary account Harlan Dow had established for the purpose of managing the Aldridge estate proceeds. Elliot did not see it as a check he could hold in his hands. He saw it as a number on a document that Harlan faxed to him from Waterloo. He read the number, set the document on the kitchen table, and went out to check the stock tank heater in the east pasture because it had been acting up and the temperature was dropping. He needed to move. He needed the cold air and the familiar work of a man who knows his own property. The number on that document was real, but it did not feel like anything he could stand still with yet. The petroleum stock conversion completed 11 days later. $84,000 processed through the transfer agent after 6 weeks of corporate genealogy research and paperwork that Harlan had managed with the methodical patience that was his particular professional gift. Elliot had contributed to that process in ways that Harlan had not expected him to, tracking down corporate filing records on his own, making calls to SEC regional offices, spending hours in the county library with microfilm that left his eyes aching. He had not waited for the professionals to do it for him. He had worked alongside them the way a farmer works alongside a mechanic, not doing the specialist job, but making sure the job got done. The Texas escrow release was the last to arrive, and it arrived in early May of 1984, which meant that the resolution of everything Cormac Aldridge had put in that box took almost exactly 6 months from the day Elliot had opened it in a cold barn on a November morning. $112,000 minus the legal fees and state taxes that the Texas process required, transferred and confirmed. Harlan called him the morning the final number was verified. He read Elliot the total, $463,000. After all taxes, after all legal fees, after everything that the process of turning old paper into current money required of a man in time and patience, and the willingness to keep going when individual pieces of the puzzle came back as worthless. Elliot wrote the number on the top of a clean page of his legal pad. He set the pen down. He looked at the number for a while. Then he called Harlan back and told him to prepare the payoff documentation for Grundy County Savings and Loan. The full amount. Principal, interest, penalties, every dollar that Burton Crew had standing between Elliot Greer and a farm that was free and clear. He wanted it done within the week. Harlan said he would have the documents ready by Thursday. The meeting at the bank on a Friday morning in May was not what Elliot had imagined it would be during the months when imagining it had been the thing that kept him moving. He had thought in his darker moments of the preceding winter that there would be something satisfying about walking into that office with the ability to close the account, that there would be some quality of vindication in it. He was wrong about that, not in a disappointing way. In a way that told him something about himself that he thought his father would have recognized. He sat across from Burton Crew and the bank's attorney and signed the documents that Harlan had prepared. The transfer cleared. The mortgage note was marked satisfied. The foreclosure proceedings, which had been suspended under the 90-day agreement, were formally withdrawn. Crew looked at the paperwork when everything was signed and then looked at Elliot with an expression that was as close to discomfort as a man like Burton Crew was capable of displaying in a professional setting. He said that he wanted Elliot to know that the bank had been following proper procedure throughout. Elliot said he understood that. Crew said the agricultural situation had put a great many good farmers in an impossible position and that the bank had not enjoyed the foreclosure process any more than the farmers had. Elliot looked at him for a moment. Then he said he believed that was true and that he appreciated the 90 days. They shook hands. Elliot picked up his copy of the satisfied mortgage note and walked out through the lobby and into the May sunlight. He sat in his truck for a few minutes. The satisfied note was on the passenger seat. He looked at it once. Then he started the truck and drove to the county recorder's office to file the documentation that would confirm the farm was his free and clear the way it had been when August Greer handed it to him in 1978. That afternoon, he called Margaret in Ames. She had been following the process in the careful, measured way she managed everything that was uncertain. Weekly calls, questions that were practical rather than hopeful, because hope was something she had learned to hold at a distance during the preceding years. He had called her after the bond verification. He had called her after the Texas confirmation. Each time she had listened and said that was good and asked what came next. This time when he called, he told her it was done. All of it. The farm was clear. The loan was paid. There was money left over, a significant amount, and he wanted to talk with her about what came next when she was ready to come home. There was a silence on the other end of the line that was entirely different from the silences of the preceding months. It was not the silence of exhaustion or controlled fear. It had a different quality, the quality of someone who has been holding something tightly for a very long time and is only now carefully beginning to let it go. She said she would drive back on Sunday. He said he would have the kitchen clean. She almost laughed at that. Almost. The Sunday she came back with the boys was ordinary, in the way that genuinely important days often are. No ceremony, no dramatic arrival. She pulled into the driveway in the late afternoon and the boys got out first and ran toward the barn because they were 9 and 12, and barns are more immediately interesting than emotional reunions. Margaret got out of the car and stood in the driveway looking at the farm in the May light. Elliot came out of the house and they stood together for a while without saying anything that needed to be said out loud. Later after dinner, after the boys were in bed, they sat at the kitchen table and he showed her the legal pad with the numbers. He explained all of it from the beginning more completely than he had over the phone because she deserved to understand it fully and he needed to say it out loud to someone who was sitting across from him rather than 100 miles away. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. Then she said she needed to ask him something. She said she needed to know if he had understood at the auction what he was doing, or if it had simply been a moment of desperation that happened to work out. He thought about that for a long time before answering. He told her the truth, that he had not understood it, not fully, that he could not have explained to anyone, including her and including himself, why he raised his hand and said $400 in that auction yard, that it had not been rational, that the rational part of his mind had been running a quiet argument against it the entire time, and he had overruled it with something he could not name precisely. He said he thought the closest he could come to naming it was this. His father had told him something about Cormac Aldridge when Elliot was young, that Cormac had survived the Depression without losing a single acre, and that the most valuable things in the world are the ones nobody is looking at. He had been watching that crate get passed over 3 times, and something in him had put those two things together and produced a decision before his conscious mind had finished the calculation. Margaret looked at him across the kitchen table. Then she said that his father would have called that wisdom and that she was going to call it luck, and that she suspected the truth was somewhere in between, and that it did not ultimately matter because they were sitting at their own kitchen table on their own farm on a clear May night, and that was what was real. He agreed with her. That was what was real. 2 weeks after Margaret came home, Elliot drove to the Grundy County Savings and Loan for the second time in a month. This time he was not going to close a debt. He was going to look at a property. The Tatum Farm, 180 acres directly east of Elliot's property line, which Virgil Tatum had farmed for 16 years before the same combination of falling prices and rising interest rates that had nearly taken Elliot's land had taken his instead. Virgil had gone under the previous January. The bank had foreclosed in February. Virgil was living with his brother in Cedar Falls doing day labor when he could find it, trying to figure out what the next chapter of a life built entirely around farming looked like when the farming was gone. The land had been sitting since February. In a market where nobody was buying 180 acres of former farmland in Grundy County was not moving quickly. Burton Cruz Institution was holding it as a liability, trying to manage the carrying costs while waiting for buyers who were not yet appearing. Elliot met with the bank's real estate officer, a man named Putnam, who handled the portfolio of foreclosed properties. He asked about the Tatum acreage. Putnam told him the asking price, which reflected the bank's need to recover its loan balance and was somewhat above current market rates. Elliot looked at the documentation on the property. Then he made an offer, $1,000 an acre, cash, no contingencies, no financing, closed within 30 days. Putnam excused himself and came back 15 minutes later and said the bank would accept. Elliot wrote the check that afternoon. He drove home and sat in the truck in the driveway for a while before going in. The fields around him were green with the first growth of a May that felt, after the frozen months of winter, almost aggressively alive. He looked at the property line to the east where Virgil Tatum's land began. His land now. $180,000 of it purchased in a market so depressed that the price reflected not the land's actual productive value, but only what a desperate seller could get from a reluctant buyer. He did not feel triumphant about that. He had thought he might, and he did not. He went inside and found the phone book and looked up the number for Virgil Tatum's brother in Cedar Falls. Virgil answered on the third ring. His voice had the quality of a man who had learned to receive phone calls without anticipating that they would contain good news. Elliot told him who he was calling. There was a pause. Virgil said he remembered Elliot from the county. He said his tone carefully, the way a man speaks when he is not sure whether the person calling has something to offer or something to collect. Elliot said he had bought the Tatum farm from the bank that afternoon. Another pause. Longer this time. Elliot said he was calling because he wanted to make Virgil an offer. He said he wanted to lease the land back to Virgil. $1 an acre per year. Virgil could farm it the way he had always farmed it. Make his own decisions about what to plant and when to plant it. Run the operation as if it were his own, because for all practical purposes it would be. Virgil was quiet for long enough that Elliot checked the line to make sure it was still connected. Then Virgil said in a voice that was working to stay level that he did not understand. Elliot said there was not much to understand. He said the lease would run for as long as Virgil needed. When Virgil was back on his feet, when prices recovered, when things were stable enough that he could put together the financing, Elliot would sell him the land back. At exactly what Elliot had paid for it, $1,000 an acre. No interest, no markup, no conditions beyond the requirement that Virgil farm it well. Virgil said nothing for a while. Then he asked why. Elliot had thought about how to answer this question because he had known it was coming. He had thought about it on the drive home from the bank, and he had thought about it sitting in the driveway, and he had thought about it while he was looking up the number in the phone book. He told Virgil about Cormac Aldridge. Not the whole story, not every detail of the bond certificates and the legal process and the 6 months of paperwork, but the essential shape of it. He told Virgil about an old man who had inherited a fortune in 1933 and had made a choice to keep it rather than use it for his own advantage when his neighbors were suffering. He told Virgil about the note pinned to the burlap. Maybe you will. He told Virgil about the $12,000 Cormac had given quietly to the Grundy County Farm Relief Fund in 1961 without putting his name on it. He told Virgil that Cormac had written in a letter that he was keeping the assets until circumstances improved, and that if he died before that happened, he trusted that whoever found them would know what to do. Then Elliot said as plainly as he could say it that he thought Cormac had been waiting for this moment, not specifically for Virgil Tatum, not specifically for Elliot Greer, but for the moment when what had been kept finally reached the person who needed it most. Virgil was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had changed in a way that Elliot recognized because he had heard it in his own voice during those months when he was living with the possibility that everything was lost and then the possibility slowly emerging that it might not be. Virgil said he did not know what to say. Elliot said he did not need to say anything. He said he would have the lease agreement drawn up by Harlan Dow and sent to Cedar Falls within the week. He said Virgil could be back on the land before the end of the month if he wanted to be. Virgil said he wanted to be. They said goodbye, and Elliot hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a while. He thought about the letter Cormac had written to the Des Moines law firm in 1934. The way it had said in the careful handwriting of a young man in the middle of a depression that it felt wrong to prosper while neighbors were suffering, that he would keep the assets until the right moment came, that if he died before then, the right person would find them. Elliot had spent several Saturdays at the Grundy County Historical Society piecing together what he could about Cormac Aldridge's life. Audrey had helped him pull everything the archive held. It was not a great deal. Cormac had not been a man who sought documentation of himself. But what was there told a consistent story? In 1933 and 1934, at the worst of the farm crisis, Cormac had been in a position to buy distressed land from a dozen different neighbors at prices that would have expanded his operation dramatically. He had not done it, not once. He had watched other men make those purchases, men who had capital available and used it to acquire land from desperate sellers, and he had declined every opportunity. He had lived as a moderately successful single farmer for the rest of his life. Consistent, quiet, reliable. He paid his debts. He attended the meetings he was expected to attend. He did not call attention to himself. He did not expand beyond the land he had when the Depression began. There was nothing in the historical record to indicate that anyone in Grundy County had ever known Cormac Aldridge was wealthy. Not wealthy by inheritance, but wealthy by the arithmetic of compound interest applied to assets left alone for half a century. Nobody knew. He had apparently made sure nobody would know. And the only hint he left was the word he wrote on the outside of a box that sat under 50 years of barn junk until a 45-year-old farmer with $400 and 21 days stood in a muddy auction yard and could not look away. Elliot understood something about that now that he had not understood before. Cormac had not been hiding. He had been waiting. Those are different things. Hiding is about fear. Waiting is about faith. Faith in something you cannot prove and cannot control and cannot see clearly from where you are standing. Faith that the moment will eventually arrive and that when it does, the right person will recognize it. He thought about his father, August, about the rule August had held to with such absolute consistency that it had seemed during the boom years of 1980 like stubbornness rather than wisdom. You do not borrow money against land your grandfather bled for. Not because borrowing was always wrong, not because expansion was always foolish, but because the land was not just an asset, it was a contract with the people who had worked it before you and the people who would work it after you. And contracts with the past and the future deserve more caution than contracts with banks. Elliot had broken that rule in 1980 and had spent 3 years understanding why it existed. He was not going to break it again. Over the following years, he used what remained of the Aldridge estate proceeds carefully and deliberately to expand the operation in ways that August would have recognized. He bought 2 additional foreclosed properties in 1985 and 1986, when the market was still at its lowest paying cash, both times adding to the farm's acreage without adding to its debt. He modernized the equipment in stages rather than all at once. He rebuilt the operating reserves. He managed the land the way his father had managed it, with the understanding that a farm is not primarily a financial instrument, but a living system that requires consistency and patience, and the willingness to think beyond the current season. By the end of the decade, the agricultural crisis had eased. Land values had begun their recovery. Crop prices had stabilized. The farmers who had survived, and there were fewer of them than there had been in 1980, were beginning to breathe again. Elliot Greer had survived, more than survived. He had positioned himself during the years of distress to emerge from them with something his father would have called a proper foundation. In 1988, Virgil Tatum called to say he was ready. He had farmed the Tatum acreage for 4 years under the lease. He had rebuilt his operating capital through 2 good crop years. He had found financing from a federal farm credit program that had been established partly in response to the crisis that had destroyed so many operations in the early part of the decade. He had the money to buy back his land at the price Elliot had paid for it. Elliot drove out to the Tatum farm on a September afternoon, and they sat at Virgil's kitchen table, which was back in the house it belonged in, and Elliot signed over the deed. Virgil shook his hand across the table with a grip that said everything his words were too precise to hold. He said he did not know how a man thanked another man for something like this. Elliot told him the same thing his father would have told him. He said to farm it well. That was thanks enough. He drove home through the September fields, the corn standing tall and green in the late season, the light going golden over the flat land that stretched in every direction as far as he could see. He had 820 acres now, counting the 2 additional properties he had bought in 1985 and 1986, all of it free and clear. His son David, who was 16 and had the kind of relationship with the land that Elliot recognized as innate rather than taught, was already talking about what the operation would look like in 10 years. Elliot listened to those conversations with the patient attention of a man who knows that the most important thing he can give a son is not plans but principles. In the fall of 1984, a few months after everything had settled and the farm was running again, and the legal paperwork was filed, and Margaret had been back for several months, and life had returned to something that felt like its proper shape, Elliot went to the lumberyard in Grundy Center and bought the materials he needed. He built the crate himself over the course of 3 weekends in October. He was not a carpenter by training, but he was a man who had built and repaired enough structures over 30 years of farming to know how to make something that would last. He used dark oak, the same species as Cormac's crate. He fitted metal bands around it and welded them carefully. He found a hardware supplier in Waterloo who still carried the kind of heavy padlock that had been common in the 1930s, though finding one in the right style took some persistence. Inside, he placed the metal box he had purchased at a hardware store similar in construction to the one from Cormac's crate. Inside the metal box, he placed a layer of the tools he had bought at an estate sale specifically for this purpose, good quality hand tools from the middle of the century, the kind that still worked if you knew how to use them. Under the tools, he placed a layer of newspapers from 1984. And beneath the newspapers, wrapped in oilcloth, he placed the financial instruments he had assembled over the preceding months. Treasury bonds in amounts that he had calculated carefully enough to be significant to whoever found them, but purchased within the bounds of what he felt he could set aside permanently without compromising what the farm needed to operate and grow. Stock certificates and companies he had researched with the same methodical attention he had given to Cormac's certificates, companies he believed had the structural characteristics of businesses that could compound value over a long period. A document related to a small mineral lease he had identified in consultation with a Texas land attorney, a different parcel from Cormac's, but similar in character, a bet on what might be under a piece of ground that nobody was paying much attention to, and a letter. He wrote the letter at the kitchen table on a clear November evening, with Margaret sitting across from him reading and the boys doing homework at the other end of the table. He wrote it in his best handwriting, which was not as precise as Cormac's, but was careful and legible, and he took his time with it. He explained where the documents had come from. He explained what Cormac Aldridge had done, and what it had meant, and what he had tried to do in return. He wrote about August Greer and the rule about debt. He wrote about what he had learned in the winter of 1983 and 1984, about the difference between knowledge and wisdom, and how wisdom is mostly knowledge you have had long enough to feel in your body rather than just understand in your mind. He wrote that whoever found this box had found it for a reason, that there was no luck in it, not really, that what looked like luck from the outside was almost always the result of someone paying attention to something that everyone else had decided was not worth noticing. He closed the letter by saying that the money inside was for them, that it was held in trust by no one and owed to no one, that the only condition he would put on it, if he could put conditions on something he would never be there to enforce, was that whoever found it think seriously about what they were going to do next, not just for themselves, for whoever came after them. He sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it at the bottom of the metal box beneath everything else. He closed the box, placed it in the crate, nailed the lid shut, fitted the padlock, and carried it to the barn. He took a piece of chalk from the workbench and stood in front of the crate for a moment. He thought about Cormac writing those 4 characters in the auction yard, or perhaps in this same barn, or somewhere on the farm, where the decision had felt right to him. 2 letters a year, a word, a message to no one in particular and to exactly the right person. Elliot wrote on the side of the crate, E.G., 1984, keep. He set the chalk down. He stood back and looked at what he had written. Then he turned off the barn light and went back to the house. 25 years passed the way decades pass on a working farm. Not slowly and not quickly, but with the particular density of time that is full of seasons and decisions and the accumulated weight of days that matter more in retrospect than they seemed to at the time. Elliot turned 60. He turned 65. David took over the primary management of the operation, and Elliot moved into the role of the man who knows where everything is and why the institutional memory of a farm that had been in the family for over a century. Margaret's hair went entirely silver, and she ran the farm's bookkeeping with a precision that had always been better than Elliot's and became over the years the standard by which David ran his own numbers. The boys grew into men. David had children. The farm adapted to new technologies and new market conditions and new challenges the way farms always adapt through the combination of principle and pragmatism that is the only real management philosophy that works over the long term. On a Saturday morning in October of 2009, Elliot's grandson Owen, who was 8 years old and had the particular quality of focused curiosity that Elliot associated with people who were going to be interesting to know, was following him through the barn in the way that children follow grandparents when they suspect that interesting things might be about to happen. Owen stopped in front of the crate. It was sitting where it had always sat in the back corner of the barn, partially covered by a canvas tarp that had accumulated the dust of 25 Iowa winters. The chalk letters were still visible. E.G. 1984. Keep. Owen looked at the crate for a while with the careful attention of a child who has not yet learned that adults find certain questions inconvenient. He asked his grandfather what was in it. Elliot looked at his grandson looking at the crate. He was 71 years old. His back gave him trouble in cold weather, and he wore reading glasses now that he hated and could not manage without. He had farmed or overseen the farming of this land for over 40 years, and he knew every acre of it the way he knew his own hands. He told Owen it was the most expensive lesson he had ever learned and the cheapest thing he had ever bought. Owen looked at him with the expression children use when adults say things that are true, but not yet comprehensible. He asked if he could open it. Elliot said not yet. He said some things needed to stay closed until the right moment. Owen asked how you knew when the right moment was. Elliot looked at the chalk letters on the side of the crate. He thought about a muddy auction yard in November of 1983. He thought about the sound of a gavel and $400 and a barn full of people who had all made the same decision about something they had not bothered to look at closely enough. He told Owen that you did not always know in advance. He said that sometimes the right moment announced itself and sometimes you only recognized it after you were already in it. He said the important thing was to be paying attention, to not be so certain that something had no value that you stopped looking at it. Owen seemed to consider this seriously the way children consider things when they sense that what is being said to them is meant to last. He asked what was in the crate. Elliot looked at his grandson for a long moment. He said it was something that someone would need more than he did. Someone he had not met yet. Someone who might not be born yet for all he knew. He said he was keeping it for them. Owen looked at the crate and then back at his grandfather. He asked if that was not strange keeping something for a person you had never met. Elliot said he had learned that from a man named Cormac Aldridge, who had been dead for 26 years and who had kept something for Elliot for 50 years without knowing his name or his face or anything about him, except that he would eventually be standing in the right place at the right moment, paying attention to the right thing. Owen thought about that for a while. Then he asked if Cormac had known that Elliot would find it. Elliot put his hand on the boy's shoulder. He looked at the crate in the back corner of the barn with the dust of 25 years on the canvas, and the chalk letters still visible, and the padlock still closed, and everything inside still waiting. He said he did not think Cormac had known. He said he thought Cormac had hoped, and that hope held carefully and long enough and put somewhere where the right person could eventually find it was sometimes enough. They stood together in the barn for a while longer, the old man and the boy, in the particular silence of a place where work gets done and things get kept, and the distance between one generation and the next is shorter than it looks. Then Owen asked if they could go see if the barn cats had kittens yet. Elliot said they could. They walked out of the barn together into the October light, and the crate stayed where it was in the back corner under the canvas, with the chalk letters facing out toward the door, where anyone paying close enough attention could read them. E.g. 1984, keep.